Eoghan Corry, a different Eoghan,
to join me here, I suppose, to launch the website. Eoghan is a local, but a very well-renowned writer, journalist and a tourism expert, so thank you all.
Míle maigad, Susan. Broúil bheithan seo anachta ócáid an speisialta Heritage Town website. Tá an cuid star agus tíreolaíocht agus cultúr I Cildrutha. Níos mó ná a credan cuid is mó de daoine atá icóníonn seo. An star as an chuigú I buint le naomh páric, buint le naomh macua, ach buint le an cuid an drám éhan na beag as an áit seo. Baile marga an ceann den na bailtí is tábhachtaí sa nochtú ísteag fás mór déanra a tháinig ar an baile sa fiú déag tá sé sin simúl freisin. I've got a little snapshot of what Celbridge means, special things, the little superlatives that Celbridge can offer. For those who don't know me, I'm basically a travel writer. I spend my life wandering from country to country, seeing what people are putting into the tourism market. A couple of things strike you very quickly in my business. A lot of the most interesting stuff nobody goes to see because it's not accessible. A lot of the least interesting stuff is talked up beyond what it can possibly bear, and people turn up in large numbers. And the good news for Celbridge is we've got a terrific heritage background, and we can actually dangle any one of about half a dozen serious tourism and history angles in front of tourists who make their way to Ireland. How many people come to Ireland? We perform very, very well. Over 10 million to the island, 10.5 million to the island. Celbridge has a star attraction, glad to say. It's where the cabinet sat today, Castletown House. It's the 13th most visited tourist attraction on the island. And then when you would factor in the Kildare Village, which doesn't count in tourism statistics, that would do not quite twice, about 40%, 50% more of what the Guinness Storehouse, our most visited tourist attraction, would do. We have another very big one in the area. So we've got 9, the only ones that aren't about 20 miles from Celbridge, by the way, that perform very highly are Cliffs of Moher, which is the second biggest, the Giant's Causeway, which is the 5th biggest, and Titanic Centre, which is the 9th biggest. And to give an example, in tourism terms, how well Castletown is performing, it's within about 80,000 visitors of Titanic Centre, and you know how much noise they make about their contribution to tourism. I think we're in a position where the numbers, the through flow is coming already, and what Breda and her team are doing is very, very welcome, because that's actually loading on the degree of the history and the little special effects, the background that Celbridge can do. We're very, very historic. We go back to the 5th century because part of what this website is doing is delivering the message of how important Celbridge heritage is to Celbridge, to our own population. What tends to happen when towns grow very fast, and we saw a bit of it in the 80s, some of the people in the room had been involved in efforts to manage that. What tends to happen is people lose their sense of identity. I think what the group are doing will not just sell Celbridge to the visitor who has a chance of coming through, but also bring home just how important our own history is. What did we do in Celbridge? Way back we had very, very strong connections with the major saints. St. Patrick has a connection with Ardras back to the 6th century, and St. Macua, which would be the North Kildare, South Dublin saint, very associated with T Lane. Church of the Bridge. How do you tell what's even older than Cildrutha? You tell it by the place names. Etymology is important. The old word for church is the modern word for Sunday, Donach. And Donacumper would probably win the prize for being the very first monastic site in the area. Teach was another one. Teach is modern word for house. It would have been Stacumney, would be Saint Umnach's Teach. And Teach would have been his little kiddie, his chapel. So already, by the time Cildrutha gets talked about and the T Lane Church gets founded, and the T Lane Church, the stone church, comes from the mid-14th century. You can tell it by the bell coats. The big spated building that went on the mid-14th century. Straffan was built around then, Uachtarard was built around then, the church that's there, obviously the Round Tower is a bit older. They all came in a spate of building when there was a lot of money floating around the county. I suspect, like the most of Europe, it got wiped out by the Black Death, the plague, which wiped out like 1/3 of the population of Europe. It was the Holocaust. It brought Norway to a halt as a country, and it brought entire cities, including some in Ireland, to a halt. County Kilkenny and South Kildare were particularly badly affected. So our church in T-Lane comes from that period. Then we have boom time in Celbridge, we had probably the wealthiest monastery in the country. How do we know it was one of the wealthiest? St. Wulston's, and again you see a little bit of politics going on. Why is Wulston the local saint? St. Patrick was Irish, associated with Armagh. Mochu is associated with Kildare. A little bit of a tripartite battle to see who would be patron saint of Ireland. By about the 11th century, Patrick had won that. Armagh had beaten Kildare, which is a bad omen for the All-Ireland qualifier that's due up. But then Adam de Hereford arrived, and Wulston was just dead. So our local saint becomes Wulston. It's quite clearly a statement, hey, we're having none of this St. Patrick or St. Bridget stuff around here, guys. We're going to have a Norman saint. And St. Wulston's monastery in 1536 was the very first monastery to be abolished in Ireland under St. Henry VIII's order. How did that happen? It was very, very wealthy. Celbridge was always where the wealthy congregated. It's a bend in the Liffey before you hit Dublin. It's where we get the grandees. We tend not to get people holding on to land very long, because the next group of our revis arrive and buy them out or plunder them. St. Wulston, of course, was abolished by Gerald Aylmer, who was an Ardclough-man. So if you're going to make an Ardclough-man in charge of abolishing the monasteries, the first one he'd abolish is the one in Celbridge. Next, we had quite a spectacular series of battles in the area. Nearby Newcastle more or less became the headquarters and the Irish headquarters during the three-sided civil war we had in the 1640s. The castle in Barberstown still has the cannonball damage under Ardras Hill. It's called the Horses' Field. Local lore would have it that Cromwell camped his horses there. It was actually George Monk, Cromwellian journal. He fought on one side, then switched sides and fought on the other. He camped his horses there on the way to the siege of Rathcoffey. So all of this was happening in the 1640s. Celbridge got wiped out, population fell to about 102, and then the Dongans rebuilt the place. They were the prominent family, almost all trace of them wiped out by the Connollys after the Battle of the Boyne. And it's nice to see that in T-Lane, the Breda's referenced that the Dongan memorial has re-emerged. Celbridge people would identify strongly with, because our main street bears the marks of it. Our main street was designed by the designers brought in by William Connolly. William Connolly didn't get it as confiscated land. He was in charge of confiscations. He ended up with a lot of confiscated land. He actually bought out the Dongans. It was a big deal. He complained in his letters about the state of the town, as new landlords tend to do, and then he set out a plan to rebuild it. From the 1720s on, Kildrout House was the very first up, and there was a plan to build the main street. It took a long time to put together, 1720 up to the usual house just at the gates here that people would see as they leave with the weather vane. The Jasmine Lodge, known as Mulligan's House for generations of Mulligans that have lived there, that would have emerged in the 1750s. So we had a stone-built main street, which I think ranks right across Europe as heritage offering on its own, and that's before you start countering in the fact that Castletown House, big house, two most famous things it offers are the staircase and the long hall. That's what gives it some sort of international punch. But when you start factoring in all the other large houses, there are about half a dozen more. St. Wulston's itself, the original house, which became the girls' school, and when the girls' school moved in 2002, has now been bought again. Hopefully we'll see that back in business again. All of those houses around Celbridge give it that character as being the playground from Dublin where the latest group, the wealthiest, the flashiest, the showiest all came. We were capital of Ireland. We were capital of Ireland when Catherine Connolly died, and for a few years nobody moved into the house, so the Lord Lieutenant moved in. And then another set of Lord Lieutenants, William Cavendish in that case, he later became Prime Minister of England. Well, another set of Lord Lieutenants moved in the 1820s. So when Leo Varadkar summoned the forces to meet in Castletown House today, he was maintaining a tradition that Celbridge, a playground of Dublin, is almost like the Windsor or the Chequers of Dublin, where at one stage they were thinking of buying a residence for the Lord Lieutenant, and they looked at Celbridge. It looked like it was going to happen immediately after the famous visit by a very, very drunk George IV, a royal visit in 1821. He was decanted from Dublin as far as Celbridge and on to the Curragh, and he came through, and at that stage they were looking at moving the Lord Lieutenancy out to Celbridge. And then in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, we were absolutely boomtown. We are the biggest woolen mill in Ireland. The intel of the 1820s was what was happening here. And we also, very, very big on big house history. Everybody would have followed the hard work that was done by the likes of Lena Boylan in tracing the papers, which were less accessible than the days before everything was online. But we had a little history as well. We had a big accumulation of people emigrating, moving into Celbridge to work in the woolen mill. We had probably the first trade union in the country. We probably the first strike action in the country. It was totally illegal in the Williamite rules at the time. So we had all of that action and meetings, and at the time the Tithe War was underway. Celbridge's Tithe War got tied up, entangled in a trade union movement. Then the whole thing collapses, the mill burns down. We're important enough to get one of the workhouses in the county, and that brought a shadow of its own on the place. Anybody who thinks they're having a bad time, just wander around the graveyard where we don't know how many people were buried, layers upon layers upon layers of people.
Irish Revolution, of course, very topical, very successfully commemorated last year. A couple of important things happened. Pádraig Pearse, one of his few cases that he actually ran was the defence of Donal O'Buachla in Celbridge Courthouse. We did have a couple of engagements around the War of Independence, and we had one of my favourite battles of all time, the Battle of Sticumney. There was about 5 hours of engagement, and I think the only casualty was a sprained ankle. It came very, very late in the day, just before the truce, which was roundly celebrated in Celbridge. Very prominent local personality, Art O'Connor, ended up Minister for Agriculture in the second Dáil government in 1922 from Celbridge. Really important, the first time that Irish Army uniforms were worn was in Celbridge barracks, because it was from there that they marched to Beggar's Bush to take the barracks from the departing British soldiers. No photographs allowed of the British soldiers departing. Photographs were allowed of the Free State Army as it was arriving, and the British had sewed through the flagpole so the tricolour could not be raised.
Out of Clyne, the population down to about 600, less than the population of Strafford, probably less than what fits on a commuter train from Hazelhatch into Dublin. The low point was the 1940s. Barney Reynolds comes along, builds the mill. We now have a mill humming again. The population starts growing again. When the mill closes in 82, immense community spirit gets it all back on the road again as a community centre. And that, I think, is probably the characteristic of the Celbridge that I know. Booms and busts come to towns, and some of them take decades to recover. Celbridge, probably because of its 19th century boom-bust cycle, just treats it as, on top of the economic disasters, came almost a man-made one. In 1967, we were zoned for rapid growth. The threat of development, we had 13 major housing developments in a very short period of time. I suspect that the wind will start blowing in that direction again. I would urge everyone in Celbridge to be very, very careful. We celebrate what we have, celebrate the parklands we have. One of the things that is quite odd about Celbridge is, unlike a lot of towns, it doesn't the river the heart of the action. A lot of the reason it didn't was when it was being built in the 18th century, rivers are very smelly places. In a way, that gives us an advantage, a logical advantage, in that we don't have a dramatic imposition on the wildlife on the river. It flows along the backs of the houses on one side of the street and on to the Castletown parklands, and the Castletown parklands and the domain are a joy to behold, something to be celebrated by our visitors, but really important by our residents.
Celbridge near Dublin, and a fleet of canoeists proving that there's more than one way of making the most of Liffey water.
One of the things that the internet has done in the very short couple of decades that it's been running, given the new generation access to information, the likes of which we as children could only dream about.
We live in Celbridge.
We ended up the fastest growing town in Ireland in 1986. We came very close, losing Castletown Domain completely. Celbridge and Leixlip were to be joined up together. We ended up with this very odd shape. It looks like Odie from the Garfield cartoon. That's the shape of Celbridge as you look at it from outside of the planet. And it's great, with great pleasure, that in safe hands, the safe hands of the Heritage Group, that we have a website now that is going to promote Celbridge to visitors, going to put us into that marketing speed. You can go to parts of America where they will show you the oldest listed building, and it was built in 1932 or something like that. But we can actually get all that information at the hands, not of the professionals, because the likes of most of the people who are in the Heritage Group, they're all quite knowledgeable about our history. It's been well researched, it's been well put out there. But we need every one of our 21,000 residents to know exactly why Celbridge is great and what it's famous for. And this is the joy of what's happening here tonight, is that that information is empowering people. It's going to get a 12-year-old, it's going to drive them on to research the soft bits of our history that haven't been well researched, and there are hundreds of them. It'll drive people back into not just the big history of the big houses or the little history of the Coswinter and the trade unions and every single aspect of what has gone before makes us part of what we are now, and it just gives me huge pleasure to Corr Shoal on Sivitherland Shut, Havachtuk, Fisrock, and to congratulate everyone that is involved with it. Thank you very much.